6 months earlier, life had taken a cruel twist, and I'd found myself in the middle of a storm I never anticipated. It started innocently enough, a routine day at work, the usual hum of activity around me. That afternoon, a heated argument with my wife, Kathy, unfolded over the phone. Her voice carried an edge of frustration I hadn't heard before. "We need to talk when you get home," she said sharply before abruptly ending the call. I'd assumed it was about our dwindling finances or another mundane concern, but the truth was far darker. That evening, her admission shattered me. "I've been seeing someone else," she confessed, unable to meet my gaze. The words struck like a thunderclap. My anger, disbelief, and confusion battled for dominance, leaving me speechless. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the unraveling of the life I'd meticulously built with her. To add salt to the wound, the man she'd been involved with was none other than Bob, a supposed friend who'd shared our dinner table countless times. Over the next few weeks, emotions ran high. I tried to salvage what was left of our marriage, attending counseling sessions and making compromises, but Kathy's heart was no longer in it. The cracks in our relationship widened until they became impossible to bridge. Friends and family offered their condolences, but their words only deepened my sense of isolation. The house, once a sanctuary, became a prison of memories. It wasn't long before the divorce proceedings began. Each court appearance, another wound. Kathy's demands were relentless, and Bob's presence added fuel to the fire. He flaunted his newfound connection with her, unapologetically inserting himself into the proceedings. My lawyer advised me to keep my composure, but every encounter left me simmering with anger. The final straw came when Bob had the audacity to confront me at a neighborhood event, taunting me with veiled threats and smug remarks. My fists clenched, and it took every ounce of self-control to walk away. That night I sat alone, replaying the events in my mind. Something in me snapped, and I realized I needed to fight back, not with violence, but by regaining control of my life. In the weeks that followed, I channeled my anger into rebuilding myself. The gym became my haven. Each weight lifted a step toward reclaiming my strength. I sought solace in hobbies I'd abandoned years ago, finding moments of peace in woodworking and running. Friends who'd drifted away slowly returned, and I began to rebuild the social circle I'd neglected during my marriage. Slowly but surely, I was piecing myself back together. Despite the progress, the wounds Kathy and Bob left were slow to heal. Nights were the hardest, the silence amplifying the echoes of betrayal. But amidst the turmoil, I found hope in my children. Their laughter, their innocence, reminded me of what truly mattered. I resolved to be the father they needed, someone they could depend on in a world that had already shown them its harsh side. By the time I reached that prison cell months later, I'd learned one important lesson. No matter how broken life may seem, it's possible to rebuild, and that's exactly what I intended to do. One day at a time, starting with my release, it was close to the dead of night, about 2 a.m. The halls were dimly lit, with only the faintest glow from a few scattered lights breaking through the heavy darkness in my cramped, starkly furnished cell. Faint silhouettes of the sparse items inside surrounded me. I lay on the hard cot, hands cradling the back of my head as thoughts swirled relentlessly, keeping sleep at bay. My mind wandered to places I had tried to lock away, dredging, up memories I wished would stay buried. The eerie quiet was broken by the sound of measured footsteps. I counted them, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10, before a figure came into view. His expressionless face betrayed no emotion, much like the others here. This was just another night on his patrol, a mundane routine that didn't require him to notice me, nor did I expect him to. As he passed my cell, I stopped keeping track of the time. It wouldn't matter. I knew he wouldn't return for nearly an hour and a half. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about life after this place. 5 days and a wake-up and I'd walk out of here for good. 7 months of a 1-year sentence were behind me. My job would be waiting, but everything else would be different. My brother Gary had kept my life afloat, fixing my car, managing my house, and preserving what little money was left after legal fees. Was I angry? That didn't even cover it. But I kept those feelings locked away for now. I understood why long sentences leave men hollow. Humanity doesn't survive here. It's just survival. And this prison was easy compared to the hardcore facility, up north. I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep. I missed my old bedroom, the one with blackout curtains. That room and the life I had known was gone for good. Gary had. That's easy. Thought you'd ask for something tougher to sneak past my wife. Gary had offered me a room at his place while I got back on my feet. It won't be fancy, he added, but it's clean and you'll have your freedom. I thanked him. He brushed it off. We're family. Don't worry about Mom and Dad. They'll come around eventually. But we both knew that wasn't guaranteed. The wounds in our family ran deep. Seen my kids? I asked. Yeah, Gary said. Heather's the same, but John's got that awful bowl haircut everyone likes now. Told him it looked like crap, but he said I wasn't. His dad, and didn't have to listen. If Mom hadn't been there, I'd have slapped him. John wouldn't have dared talk like that if I'd been around. He and his sister would stay with their mom for now. The divorce was final, but Kathy owed me $65,000 for my share of the house. She'd probably already emptied our lockbox, but my lawyer had everything listed. There'd be no argument when I got out. Kathy and my ex-friend Bob had blindsided me, wrecking my life. That was over. Next time I'd be ready. I just had to survive a few more days here before starting fresh. Maybe then I could rebuild. I hoped so. Before all this, life had been good. Really good. I never saw the betrayal coming. Some friends later admitted they'd known but kept quiet. Did they think I knew and didn't care? More likely they didn't. Want to get involved. Most people don't. Now all I could do was wait, plan, and hope for a better chapter ahead. I thought we had a great marriage, 12 years, 2 kids, a nice house, and jobs we could be proud of. Sure, we had the occasional argument, but nothing unusual. I loved my wife deeply and never imagined what she was capable of. Our social circle was small, mostly neighborhood couples like us. Most had kids except Bob and Connie, who had struggled to conceive for years. Kathy probably knew why, but I stayed out of it. Connie's drinking, though, had become everyone's problem. At parties, her booze intake spiraled, turning melancholy into mean. Bob stayed sober, often carrying her home by the end of the night. Connie was something else tonight, I said one evening, getting ready for bed. She even asked Greg to help her strip down and jump in the pool. No wonder he and Judy left early. Poor Bob, Kathy replied as she tossed her clothes on the chair. Connie blamed their childlessness on Bob, a cruel and baseless accusation. Adoption was a suggestion she refused to entertain. If my husband were more of a man, we wouldn't be in this mess, she once snapped. I didn't know what to say. They'll either fix it or split, I told Kathy. Bob won't take much more. We're having dinner with them next week, she reminded me. I groaned. Let's hope she behaves, I muttered, doubting it. When dinner night came, Connie was as disruptive as ever. Waiter, how's a girl supposed to get a drink? She yelled, drawing stares. Then she turned on Bob, berating him loudly, his face flushed with anger, fists clenched under the table to diffuse the tension. I stood and said, Connie, you promised me a dance. She hesitated, but let me lead her to the dance floor. We swayed, through a few songs, or rather, I held her upright. Eventually, she muttered, I need to pee. I guided her to the restroom and waited outside. After 5 minutes, I asked 2 women entering to check on her. One came back, shaking her head. She's passed out in a stall, she said. I sighed, wondering how much longer Bob would endure this chaos. With help, I got Connie to the sink and splashed cold water on her face. She stirred briefly but couldn't stand, so I half-carried her back to the table. Bob's face showed equal parts, embarrassment and frustration. "Bob, let me help you get her to the car," I said, still supporting her. "I've got it, Steve," he snapped, his voice tight. "This isn't the first time, but it'll be the last." Ignoring him, I helped carry Connie out while he grabbed her purse and muttered a quick goodbye. We loaded her into the back seat, and I gave Bob a pat on the shoulder. "Sorry, man," I said, unsure of what else to offer. Bob sighed. "Thanks. I'm at my wit's end. I don't know what to do anymore." "You need counseling," I suggested. "Neither of you can handle this alone. Kathy and I are here if you need support." He nodded, but I doubted they'd follow through. Their marriage seemed doomed, and I figured it was only a matter of time. 3 weeks later, sirens broke the quiet of a Thursday night. Flashing lights lit up the end of the block. I ran outside to find Bob's car smashed into a parked vehicle. Firefighters were prying open the driver's door. "What happened?" I asked a neighbor. "It's Connie," they said. "They fought." She grabbed the keys, speed off, and crashed. I watched paramedics load her into an ambulance. Bob climbed in after her, his face a mix of worry and exhaustion. Their house, now chaotic with lights blazing and furniture overturned, told the rest of the story. The next morning, Kathy called me frantic. "Connie's on life support. Meet me at the hospital." When I arrived, Bob sat in the waiting room, hollow-eyed and broken. "The doctors say there is almost no brain activity," he said quietly. We sat in silence as Connie's parents arrived. Their grief filled the room as they spoke with the doctor. Hours later, the decision was made to turn off the machines. 48 hours later, surrounded by loved ones, Connie passed peacefully. The funeral was packed, tears flowing freely. Despite the struggles of the past year, Bob's love for Connie was clear. He took a month off work to visit family, and I promised to look after his place. Later that night, while getting ready for bed, I turned to Kathy. "I love you. You know that, right?" She smiled, tired but warm. "If I ever end up like Connie, pull the plug, I wouldn't want to live like that." "Don't talk like that," I said. "It was a tragic mistake, but it could never happen to us." Still, the events of the past weeks lingered in my mind as I held her close, grateful for the life we shared. Bob returned a couple of weeks later, trying to piece his life back together. He asked Kathy to help him sort through Connie's clothes, and I helped him remove his old bedroom furniture when he bought a new set. By 3 months in, he seemed to be finding his footing. Our neighbors made an effort to keep him involved in social gatherings and even set him up on a few blind dates, though nothing stuck. It was too soon. Life moved forward, or so it seemed. 6 months later, Bob had a spark in his eye again. Seeing him smile and enjoy himself at gatherings was a relief. It felt like we had our old friend back, but looking back, there were signs, subtle ones, that something wasn't right. Kathy and I were still close, but I sensed a distance I couldn't quite explain. One evening I asked, "Is something bothering you?" "Not really," Kathy said with a smile. "Well, why do you ask?" "You just seem a little off lately," I said carefully. "Everything's fine," she insisted. "Maybe you're just not getting enough Zex. If you want more, just ask." Zex. She'd never called it that before. It was always making love. I brushed off the unease and let it go. Then came Friday, August 20th, the day everything fell apart. Kathy called me at work saying the kids would be at her parents' for the weekend. "What time will you be home?" she asked. "I'll come home early," I said, excited for what I thought would be a romantic weekend. I arrived home to find 2 cars in the driveway, one of them Bob's. Inside, Kathy and Bob stood in the kitchen. "Hey, Bob," I greeted him, confused. "What's going on?" "Steve, we need to talk," Kathy said, her voice trembling. "About what?" I asked, uneasy. Divorce, she said, barely audible. The word hit me like a freight. Train. What are you talking about? Divorce, I demanded. I'm in love with Bob, she admitted, wringing her hands. Rage surged through me. Bob? Get the hell out of my house now, Steve. This involves him too, Kathy said, stepping closer to Bob. Get out before I make you leave in a body bag, I warned, fists clenched. Bob hesitated, then turned to go. Kathy tried to follow. Kathy, we're talking now, I shouted. There's nothing to talk about, she said. I'm sorry, but it's over. How long has this been going on before Connie's end of life? I yelled. Bob turned, anger flashing in his eyes. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I know. While I was supporting you, you were sneaking behind my back. You disgust me. I demanded they both leave. This is my house, too, Kathy said defiantly. Not anymore, I shot back. Get out. Bob urged her toward the door. Let's go, he said. You'll regret this, I spat as they backed out the door, avoiding my glare. As they left, I stood in the kitchen, my world shattered, vowing they wouldn't get away with this betrayal. I lost it after that. 2 beers in, I smashed dishes, broke the microwave, and put holes in 4 walls. Not bad for 2 hours of rage. 4 trips later, I had emptied Kathy's closet, dumped everything on the lawn, and turned on the sprinklers for good measure. I locked the doors, put on the chains, and drank 4 more beers while listening to Kathy scream outside. By beer 6, I passed out, waking up the next morning to find her things gone. At least I didn't have to drag them to the curb. Still, I was devastated and angrier with every passing thought. When I called Kathy's parents to check on the kids, her mom shut me down. Kathy picked them up last night, she said. Nonsense, Fran. She was busy collecting her clothes off the lawn. I roared. She hung up, furious. I canceled our credit cards, withdrew as much cash as possible, and planned my day. Change the garage code, install new locks, and move valuables to my brother Gary's house. While preparing to leave, the doorbell rang. A man with a large envelope waited outside. I didn't answer. I knew he'd catch me eventually, just not today. I called Gary, filled him in, and told him to keep the valuables under wraps. He sympathized, calling Kathy a piece of work. Then I headed to Home Depot for new locks. Driving home, I spotted Bob's car in my driveway, Kathy loading things into it. Rage overtook me. Instead of passing by, I floored it. My car slammed into Bob's, shoving it into the garage door. I reversed, hit him again, and finally drove his car halfway through the garage. Before my engine stalled, adrenaline pumping, I grabbed my son's bat and started swinging. Bob cowered in the driver's seat as I shattered windows and cracked the windshield. I was about to rip open his door when I heard shouting. Drop the bat and put your hands on your head. I turned to see 2 officers, tools drawn. I dropped the bat, complied, and was cuffed on the garage floor. Bob crawled out, pale and trembling, while Kathy sobbed nearby, talking to the police and glancing at me. I smiled at her at the station. I was booked and given 1 phone call. I called Gary. With it being the weekend, I spent 2 nights in jail. On Monday, I faced a judge, pleaded not guilty, and had bail set. By late afternoon, Gary got me out. They're talking about attempted homicide or attack with a deadly weapon, Gary said as we left. I know, I replied. First, stop the bank. By the time we arrived at the bank, Kathy had already drained our savings and checking accounts. The CDs and bonds in the lockbox remained untouched, but a court order barred me from accessing them. Frustrated, I called her cell. You could have left me for hours, I said, my voice tight with anger. You're cheap, you know that? I need the money for me and the kids, Kathy replied evenly. Until the rest is released, I don't have much choice. Doesn't Bob make enough for you? I snapped back. I still have a house payment. Maybe I should light a fire in the living room to warm it up. Steve, stop talking crazy, she said, her tone shifting to concern. Why can't you just move on? I will, I shot back. Once you send my kids back, I can't. Not with you in this state, she said. I don't think you'd hurt them, but I can't take the chance. You'll see them after this settles. You don't need to worry about them, I said sharply. You and Bob, though. That's another story. I'm done talking, Kathy said firmly. From now on, go through my attorney. A moment later, the line went dead. At my court date weeks later, my lawyer pleaded temporary insanity, arguing that Kathy's confession about Bob had made me snap. Kathy and Bob testified that I'd threatened them, citing the restraining order as proof of their fear. Mr. Moore, the judge asked, did you tell Mr. Kelly he'd leave in a body bag? I don't recall exactly, I replied. But how would you feel if your wife was sleeping with your friend? The judge wasn't impressed, and my lawyer scolded me. Say nothing more. Forget everything you said or did. My boss, Chris, testified as a character witness, calling me a model employee. His words helped, but after closing arguments, the judge postponed his ruling. The next day, Chris pulled me aside. Steve, I know guys who can make them disappear. Thanks, I said. But this is my problem. 6 months and $12,000 later, I was divorced. Kathy got half of everything. The house was sold, and even her false claim about missing jewelry didn't stick. But the system wasn't done with me. The judge sentenced me to a year in jail. That's insane, I yelled at my lawyer. It could have been worse, he said. With good behavior. You'll be out in 8 months and the charge will clear in 2 years. Do your time and move on. Easier said than done. Appeals went nowhere, and my life had crumbled in under a year. Before I turned myself in, Chris reassured me, your job's waiting. Stay smart and watch your back. On Sunday, I saw my kids one last time, then reported to the county jail. Despite my research, nothing prepared me for the reality. Gary deposited money into my inmate account, but it mostly went to junk food and basic supplies. Without a phone or computer, I started writing to pass the time. Collect calls every 2 weeks kept me in touch with my family. During a visit, Gary said, I'll have your car fixed before you're out. I also had the deadbolts installed and told Kathy she needs to give 24 hours notice if she wants to stop by. His support helped, but I still had months ahead to endure. Thanks to Kathy and Bob, Gary had my back, and I was thankful. Kathy had taken the kids' clothes and hers, but stopped short of furniture after Gary told her she'd need a court order. She'd let my parents see the kids every other Sunday, but made it clear it was a courtesy. According to my mom, Kathy called me their jailbird father and made it clear she'd set strict visitation terms once I was out. With a week left, I confirmed my visitation schedule every other weekend, a month in summer and alternating holidays. I let Chris know I'd need a week to get back on track after my release. The day I traded my jumpsuit for street clothes felt incredible. Gary was waiting outside, and we headed to the first bar we saw to freedom, I said, clinking bottles. Gary smiled. Andy's got a steak dinner waiting for you. You can crash with us for a few nights before sorting things at the house. It's still on the market, but no offers yet. Kathy wants to drop the price. Needs your approval. Dinner was amazing. I ate and drank more than I had in 8 months. By morning, I regretted it. A note from Gary awaited me in the kitchen. If you're reading this, you survived. Coffee's ready and everything else is in the fridge. Keys to your car and house are by the back door. Don't do anything stupid. See you at 5:30. After coffee, a shower, and a shave, I felt human again. Dressed in fresh clothes, I headed to the house. The exterior looked the same, but stepping inside, it was a mess. Clothes were scattered, furniture missing, and the kitchen had long expired food in the fridge. The sight of the wall where I'd punched during my fight with Kathy and Bob brought back memories. I rubbed my knuckles, recalling the betrayal that led to my anger. Upstairs, the kids' closets were empty except for a few forgotten items. My bedroom was stripped bare except for my dresser. The dark spots on the carpet where the bed and Kathy's furniture once stood made the room feel cold, lifeless. It wasn't mine anymore. It would need a complete overhaul. Downstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and made a list of repairs, cleaning, and replacements. I tucked the list in my pocket and headed to the bank. The lockbox was unsurprisingly empty. I requested documentation of the withdrawal and learned the bank had video footage of the lockbox area if needed. Another blow, but not unexpected. It was time to rebuild on my own terms. A call to my attorney confirmed Kathy had taken everything. The good news, he said, is the court ordered her to return the CDs and bonds to the lockbox. She wants to trade. Her share of the house for your share of the CDs and bonds, he added. Tell her to comply with the order or I'll have her arrested, I said firmly back at the house. I took stock of the damage. I called Hank, a contractor, to repair the walls, and Mary maids for a deep cleaning, especially in the kitchen and dining room where I'd trashed everything. Thankfully, the utilities were still on, so I planned to move back in after buying a bed. Mattress shopping was overwhelming, but I settled on a basic set for $900. At least it wouldn't have bad memories attached. When Hank arrived, he inspected the walls. Must have hurt hitting that stud, he said with a grin. I just want it patched and painted, I told him. House $200, he offered. That's low, I replied. Steve, after what you did to Bob's car, you're a legend in the neighborhood. You're a hero, he said, insisting on the price. I thanked him, though. He couldn't fully understand what I'd been through. Within 6 weeks, the house was repaired, cleaned, and the CDs and bonds were back in the lockbox. Life felt like it was slowly returning to normal. When the kids stayed for their first weekend, it was awkward at first, breaking the silence. I told them, this is still your home. Speak your mind. You won't hurt my feelings, John said. We love you, Dad. We're sorry about what Mom did. Heather nodded. We didn't know about Bob until we had to live with him. We didn't like it then. And we don't like it now. It wasn't your fault, I reassured them. What your mom and I had is over, but I'll always be your dad. I love you, and I'm here for you. We ended the night with pizza and a movie, and for the first time in months, it felt like a family again. I resisted the urge to badmouth their mother. It wasn't the right time. Instead, I focused on helping John ditch his bowl cut and supporting them in soccer and dance, filling my time with their activities. While friends urged me to move on and start fresh, I wasn't ready. I wasted 14 years. On her, I'd tell them. If I want to stay mad, that's my right. Kathy pushed to lower the house price. I refused. If you want to knock $20,000 off your share, fine, I said. Otherwise, it stays. Eventually, we divided the CDs and bonds. Kathy blew through her share in 3 months on a new car and a vacation with Bob. I banked mine, determined to rebuild on my terms. Roughly 8 months after my release from jail, Bob's house was engulfed in flames. According to the investigation, someone had poured gasoline into the electrical panel and along the back of the property before setting it alight while the family was out at a soccer game by the time the fire was extinguished. The rear half of the house was a charred ruin, and the entire property was left without electricity. The very next day, 2 officers appeared at my doorstep and brought me to the station for questioning. Steve, you were just a block away, one officer said, his tone sharp with suspicion. You could have easily slipped over there and done this. I met his gaze steadily. Then prove it. They threw out more accusations, trying to rattle me, but I let them talk themselves in circles. When I'd had enough, I stood and said firmly, I think we're done here. The bigger officer leaned forward, clearly trying to intimidate me. Mr. Moore, we're not finished. Then either charge me, let me go, or watch. Me call my lawyer. I'm not saying another word without legal counsel, I replied, pulling out my phone. The 2 exchanged a glance before the smaller cop reluctantly spoke. We'll release you, but don't think for a second we're not watching. As they let me leave, I couldn't help but feel a small victory. 1 problem down, a couple more to tackle. Since Bob's home was uninhabitable, I stepped up and offered to take care of the kids for a while. With the house repairs estimated to take a couple of months, I treated the time as an extended break for the 3 of us. One evening, as Kathy came by to pick up the kids, she didn't waste time getting to the point. "Steve, I know you're behind. The fire, no matter what the police decide." Feigning ignorance, I raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about. I spent the whole day with our friends. Or should I say my friends now? Funny how you and Bob don't get invited anymore. Should I speak to them for you?" "Don't bother. We wouldn't show up even if they begged," she shot back, her bitterness palpable. "Well," I said with a smirk, "at least you and Bob have each other. That's what really matters, right? For now, anyway." "What do you mean by that?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Nothing. Just saying you're lucky to have him." This time, I didn't bother hiding my grin. As the kids grew closer to me, Kathy and Bob's frustrations seemed to deepen. The kids often confided in me about fights at home, shouting at Bob to stop pretending to be their father. Kathy's efforts to mediate only made things worse. One evening, Kathy called me. "Steve, stop stirring things up between Bob and the kids," she demanded, her voice tight with irritation. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, keeping my tone deliberately cool. "I've never spoken ill of you. I've told them you're their mom, and they need to respect and listen to you." "And Bob?" she shot back, her tone sharp. "Bob," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. "Well, he's a backstabbing, spineless idiot who never should have made it past childhood. Aside from that, he's fine." Her sharp intake of breath crackled over the line. "He's good to your kids, Steve. Leave him out of it." "That's not going to happen," I said, my voice hardening. "The man means nothing to me, and someday I'll gladly be the one to spit on his grave." "Steve, I swear," she started, but I cut her off. "What's left, Kathy?" I snapped, my tone icy. "Cheat on me again. Divorce me. Get me locked up. You've already done it all, haven't you? There's nothing more you can do." She hung up in fury, and I couldn't help but mutter to myself. Hard to believe I once loved that woman. Work, on the other hand, was going smoothly. Within a few weeks of being back, I was caught up, and my boss, Chris, encouraged me to take on more responsibilities. I agreed, given that I had plenty of free time. While most of the new accounts were straightforward, one TBU Inc. posed some challenges. The company was overhauling their manufacturing system, which required frequent visits to stay updated. Unfortunately, the engineer assigned to me, though knowledgeable, was a disorganized mess, and I wasn't getting the data I needed. "Chris," I told him, "I hate to complain, but if I don't get the right information, this project is going to hit a wall." After a few calls, the company assigned Monica Bradley, a seasoned process engineer, to work with me. "Steve," she said, introducing herself with a handshake. Working with Monica was a breath of fresh air. She ensured I had what I needed, no matter what it took. 2 weeks before Phase 1 wrapped up, I decided to thank her with dinner. "Monica, let me take you and your husband out to dinner. The Hilton where I'm staying has a fantastic restaurant. How about 6 bao?" She agreed, and we shook hands before I left the plant at 4:30, eager for the evening ahead. Back at the hotel, I spent an hour plowing through emails, wondering how anyone managed life before the internet. At 5:55 p.m., I made my way to the restaurant, feeling calm and ready for the evening. Once seated, I glanced at the menu as I waited for Monica and her husband to arrive right on time. At 6, Monica entered the room, but she was alone. I waved her over and stood to greet her. "Is your husband parking the car?" I asked casually, pulling out her chair. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "Steve, I'm not married." Caught off guard, I hesitated. "Oh." I just assumed my eyes drifted to the rings on her fingers. "These," she said, holding up her hand. "They're decoys. It's just easier this way. At work, people don't bother a married woman. It spares me the awkwardness of fending off advances and protects me from unwanted gossip. Plus, let's face it, employers tend to favor married employees. They think we're more grounded." "That's clever," I admitted, intrigued. "But what happens When people ask about your husband, I keep it simple, Monica said with a shrug. He's traveling busy or something came up. After a while, they stop asking. Works like a charm. Well, you had me completely convinced, I replied with a grin. Dinner turned out to be wonderful. We talked for hours, and by the end of the night, I surprised myself by sharing parts of my life. I usually kept guarded the struggles, the betrayals, and the hard-won lessons of the past 2 years. That's awful, Monica said, shaking her head in disbelief. You didn't deserve any of that. It's over now, I said with a sigh. I'm trying to leave it behind and move forward. What choice do I have? She leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. You've got a lot going for you, Steve. You're smart, funny, and good-looking. There are plenty of women who jump at the chance to be with you. Her cheeks reddened slightly as she spoke. I laughed a little self-consciously. Maybe, but I've been out of the game for so long I'm not even sure where to start. And honestly, I'm not in a rush. Monica tilted her head, with a playful smile. Well, you asked me out, didn't you? I asked you and your husband, I reminded her, chuckling. Would you have asked if you knew I wasn't married? She teased. Probably, I admitted with a sheepish grin. You're easy to talk to, you're fun, and most importantly, you're nothing like my ex. She burst out laughing. I think I'll take that as a compliment. The evening ended on a high note, and the next day I left town, not expecting to return for several weeks. Before I left, I told Monica to reach out if she needed anything. For the first time in a while, I felt like I could trust someone outside my small circle. Over the next few months, whenever I was in town, Monica and I spent time together. Our connection grew stronger through phone calls and emails between visits, and gradually I found myself letting my guard down. Eventually, our relationship deepened into something more intimate, and I began to feel ready for something serious. But then everything unraveled. One Tuesday evening, after we'd spent time together, Monica kissed me goodnight and said, "Let's plan for a long evening Thursday, just the two of us." "Thursday it is," I said, already reminding myself to grab everything we'd need for a special night. The following evening, with no plans, I decided to explore a restaurant I'd never tried before. After searching for options, I settled on a highly rated Indian spot about 25 minutes away. I found a quiet corner booth, ordered a beer and the sampler platter, and prepared to relax. Just as my food arrived, a familiar laugh made me pause. I looked up, scanning the room, and there she was, Monica. She wasn't alone. Across the table sat a man, and judging by their body language, this wasn't a casual dinner. They leaned in close, laughed, and even held hands. I sat frozen as I watched them kiss, and suddenly I had no appetite. Finishing my beer in silence, I paid the bill and walked out. Whatever internal conflict she had mentioned clearly wasn't troubling her much. The next day, Monica was back to her usual self, brushing against me and playfully touching my arm at every opportunity. Everything. Resolved last night? I asked. Evenly. She nodded, her eyes sparkling. Yep, all handled. Tonight it's just you and me. I've got an idea for dinner, I said casually. I found this amazing place last night. Quiet, cozy, and the sampler platter is fantastic. Her face went pale. Oh. What kind of place? Indian, I said, locking eyes with her. Her expression faltered and she forced a laugh. What a coincidence. I was at an Indian restaurant last night, too. Crazy, right? I even ran into someone I knew. What are the odds? Monica, I said, my voice cold. Steve, I can explain. Don't bother, I interrupted. I've dealt with lies before and I'm not about to go through that again. I got rid of one deceitful woman, and I don't need another. Without another word, I walked away. I cut my trip short and ignored every email she sent over the following weeks. Eventually, she stopped trying. Whatever trust I'd rebuilt had been shattered, leaving me more guarded than ever. 3 months later, life threw me an unexpected surprise. Bob's office was near a busy intersection, and his parking lot was across the street from the building. On a chilly Friday evening, eager to get home, Bob stepped into the crosswalk just as the light turned green. He didn't see the black sedan speeding through the red light. The car struck him on the right side, launching him over the hood and onto the asphalt with a sickening thud. Witnesses later described the scene as unfolding too quickly for anyone to react or warn him. The two women closest to the accident couldn't provide much detail about the car. All they could say was that it was a black four-door sedan with tinted windows. Coincidentally, a description that matched my black BMW. The next evening, I was chatting with my neighbor, Tom. When a police cruiser rolled into my driveway, two officers stepped out and approached us. "Mr. Moore, we need to ask you a few questions," the shorter officer said, his tone direct. "Of course," I replied. Turning to Tom, I added, "Let's pick up this conversation later." Tom lingered for a moment, casting a wary glance at the officers before retreating back to his house. The taller officer stepped forward, consulting a small notebook. "You own a black 2002 BMW 320i, correct?" "That's right," I replied, puzzled. "What's this about? Parking tickets?" I added with a nervous chuckle, but their blank expressions quickly erased any hint of humor. "Is the vehicle here?" the officer continued. "It's in the garage," I said cautiously. "Mind telling me what's going on?" "We'd like to take a look at it," the shorter officer said, ignoring my question. I led them through the house to the garage, making an effort to appear calm. My BMW, though reliable, showed its age with a few scratches and dents, remnants of years on the road. The officers focused on the front right side of the car, snapping photos and jotting notes. "Can you explain these marks on the bumper?" one asked. "No idea," I said casually. "This car has been with me for 8 years. You can't expect it to be pristine forever." I crossed my arms. "Now that I've answered your questions, maybe you can answer mine. What's this about, and why are you so interested in my car?" "There was a hit and run yesterday involving a black sedan with tinted windows," the officer explained. "Your vehicle matches the description." "So do hundreds of others in this city," I shot back. "Do you have anything more specific, like a license, plate, or an eyewitness identifying me?" "Witnesses only saw the car," he admitted. "Well, as you can see, there's no fresh damage here," I said, gesturing around, "and I can account for my whereabouts yesterday from morning until evening. Why am I suddenly a suspect?" The taller officer hesitated, his expression unreadable. "Your history with the sufferer and prior threats you've made put you on our radar." The other officer stepped in, his tone more measured. "We appreciate your cooperation. We'll be in touch if we need anything further." "Wait!" I called out as they turned to leave. "Who's the sufferer?" The taller officer paused but didn't turn around. "A Mr. Robert Kelly," he said flatly. A smile tugged at my lips before I could stop it. "Is he dead?" I asked, unable to hide the curiosity in my voice. "No," the officer replied curtly, "but he's in critical condition." They walked off as I waved, unable to suppress my amusement. Inside, I opened a bottle of wine, ordered a pizza, and enjoyed a quiet evening. I finished the entire bottle and almost all of the pizza, feeling strangely celebratory. The neighborhood buzzed with talk of Bob's accident. Some expressed sympathy, while others muttered that he had it coming. Personally, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. 2 days later, Bob's condition deteriorated and he passed away. For the funeral, I made sure to look sharp. New suit, fresh haircut, and polished shoes. On my way, I even got my car washed and waxed. As I arrived at the funeral, home, conversations outside fell silent, and all eyes turned toward me. Inside, I ignored the guest book and walked purposefully down the aisle. Kathy, seated near the casket with my children, looked horrified when she saw me. Her shock was priceless. She jumped up, trying to intercept me, but I was faster. Reaching the open casket, I leaned over, letting years of anger surface. Without hesitation, I spit directly onto Bob's face. The spit dribbled onto his pristine shirt, leaving a glaring stain. Kathy screamed, her voice breaking into sobs as she hurled insults at me. My smirk widened. 2 down, 1 to go, I said quietly, meeting her furious gaze. Her expression shifted from anger to fear. I warned you, I added, before turning and walking out, leaving the funeral in stunned silence. Over the next month, the police questioned me twice more. Kathy insisted I was somehow involved in Bob's end of life, but they had no evidence. The case eventually went cold, and the incident faded from people's minds. One evening, I watched as a patrol car pulled into my driveway. "You're late," I said dryly, as 2 officers stepped out and approached the house. "Mr. Moore," one of them began, his tone formal as he slid a photo across the table. "Do you know a David Kent?" "Sure," I replied evenly, glancing at the photo. The officer's gaze sharpened. "How do you know him?" "I hired him to keep an eye on my ex-wife," I said matter-of-factly. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Why would you do that?" "She seems to attract trouble," I explained. "Since my kids live with her, I thought it was best to have someone ensure their safety. Kent mostly watches at night, making sure everything's fine. Your ex-wife reported feeling followed. She saw Mr. Kent multiple times and called us. When we questioned him, he mentioned you hired him," the officer said, his tone sharp. "Is that illegal?" I asked calmly. "It's not against the law," the officer said, his tone firm. "But it's dangerously close to maltreatment. You could face charges if it continues." "Noted," I replied calmly. "If the department wants to take over protecting my kids, I'll gladly step back. Otherwise, I'll keep making sure they're safe." The officer crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "Why don't you work this out with your ex-wife?" "The last time I tried that, I ended up in jail," I said flatly. The officers eventually let me go, but left me with a cliched warning about keeping an eye on me. They really needed to work on their lines. When I hired David, I didn't care about subtlety. I wanted Kathy to feel his presence, to know she was being watched. The next man I hired was even less inconspicuous, with a leather jacket, scruffy, beard, and an aura straight out of a biker gang film. He was impossible to miss. He charged $30, $0 an hour, and only worked a few hours every 4th night, but he delivered exactly what I wanted: unease. My goal was simple: to push Kathy to the brink. If she cracked under the pressure, I could use it to secure full custody of my kids. "What do you want from me, Steve?" she screamed into the phone one night, her voice laced with desperation. "Honestly, for you to drop dead," I replied coolly. She hung up without another word. Later that night, I was sitting on my porch with a drink when the inevitable happened. A police cruiser pulled into my driveway and 2 officers stepped out. I greeted them with mock enthusiasm. "Figured you'd show up sooner or later," I said, leaning back in my chair. Kathy had accused me of threatening her, but this time I was prepared. By the time we reached the station, my attorney was already waiting. "My client never threatened Mrs. Kelly," my lawyer stated. His tone even. He simply expressed a personal opinion about her demise. "That's not a threat. It's free speech." The officers weren't convinced. "She feels threatened, especially since your client has hired individuals to follow her. It's creating a hostile situation." "Hiring someone to observe another person isn't illegal," my lawyer countered. "Unless you have hard evidence of wrongdoing, this is a waste of time." The taller officer sighed in frustration. "Mr. Moore, why don't you just move on? People get divorced every day. What happened is unfortunate, but you need to let it go. If she snaps and something happens, we'll know where to look. If she agrees to give up custody of the kids, my client will step back entirely," my lawyer offered. "That's a matter for the courts," the officer replied. With nothing else to say, the meeting ended and we walked out. That Sunday morning, as I enjoyed coffee and the newspaper on my deck, the doorbell rang. It was early and I wasn't expecting. Visitors. When I opened the door, Kathy's parents were standing there. "Steve, can we have a word?" her father asked. "Sure, come on in," I said, motioning them inside. They were dressed in their Sunday best, likely coming from or heading to church. I offered them coffee, but they politely declined. "We came to talk about Kathy," her father began. "We know she's made mistakes and what happened to you wasn't fair, but she's still our daughter and we're worried about her." I nodded, leaning against the counter. "I don't want anything to happen to her either, but let's be clear, she's made her choices and now she has to live with the consequences. My priority is the kids. They'd be better off with me, especially given her string of bad luck. I don't want them caught in the crossfire if things take a turn." Her parents exchanged uneasy glances. "We'll talk to her," her mother said hesitantly. "But you know how stubborn she is. The Kathy I married wouldn't have cheated or betrayed me the way she did," I said bluntly. "I don't recognize who she is now, but if you're expecting forgiveness, don't hold your breath. I don't forgive, and I sure as hell don't forget." They left quickly after that. Clearly unsettled by my words, I figured my message had landed. On Thursday evening, the confrontation I'd been anticipating finally arrived. Just after sunset, the doorbell rang through the peephole. I saw Kathy standing there. She hadn't called ahead, which made her appearance even more satisfying. Opening. "The door!" I greeted her with a smirk. "Evening, Kathy. Care for a drink? How about hemlock?" "Do you ever stop being an a-hole?" she snapped, pushing past me into the house. I closed the door behind her. "What brings you by?" "Finally decide to admit you've been wrong all along." She ignored the jab and sat down stiffly in the living room. "I want to talk about the house," she said flatly. "Our house?" I asked. "You mean the one I've been paying for single-handedly since?" "The divorce? I still own half of it," she shot back. "I want it sold. What's it going to take for you to lower the price?" "An act of God," I replied, "unless you're willing to cover the loss and add interest." "Fine," she said, gritting her teeth. "Just get it done. I want you out of this neighborhood and out of my life." "That's never going to happen," I said calmly. "You still hate me that much?" she asked, her voice softening. "More than you could imagine," I replied. "But let's not rewrite history. This isn't about hate. It's about consequences. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." "It wasn't planned," she said, her tone almost pleading. "What happened with Bob wasn't intentional. It just happened." I shook my head, unimpressed. "Save the excuses, Kathy. They're as empty as the promises you made during our marriage." She stared at me for a moment before standing. "You're impossible, and you're predictable," I said, opening the door. "Don't let it hit you on the way out." She couldn't possibly believe I was dumb enough to fall for that line. "Don't insult me, Kathy. Nothing just happens. Unless he forced you at gunpoint. You went along with it willingly. Was he so much better in bed that you decided to burn down our marriage and shatter our family?" Her face tightened, but she didn't flinch. "It wasn't about Zex, Steve. It was about the fact that he needed me. He didn't have anyone else. And somewhere along the way, I guess we both started to depend on each other. It just grew from there." "Needed you?" I snapped, feeling my anger spike. "What were you doing? Hosting a charity drive for the emotionally destitute? I needed you. Our kids needed you. Our marriage needed you. But apparently none of that mattered because some sad, straight dog wagged his tail at you. Now he's rotting in the ground, and he's the least needy person I can think of." I let a cold smile creep across my face. I only regret that I wasn't the one driving the car that ended his pitiful existence. "God, Steve, do you even hear yourself?" She shot back, her voice cracking under the strain of her disgust. "You've turned into someone so full of hate, it's disturbing. Do you seriously take pleasure in someone else's end of life?" "I didn't get here on my own, Kathy," I said bitterly. "You and your late boyfriend deserve a lot of credit for shaping me into what I am." "Don't give me that crap," she retorted. "That's just an excuse, and you know it. Marriages fail every day. 60% of them end in divorce. Do you think every single one of those people turns into the hateful, vengeful mess you've become? I couldn't care less about anyone else's marriage, I snapped. This is about mine. How long, Kathy? How long was I the idiot, the clueless fool, while you two carried on? Does it even matter? She asked with exasperation. It matters to me, I replied firmly. Was it 2 months? 3, 5? She sighed, as though resigning herself to the conversation. About 5 months, she admitted. Not that it changes anything. The first time it happened, I almost told you. I was so upset with myself, I barely knew what to do. But you didn't, I said coldly. And clearly you weren't that upset because it happened again and again. How many times, Kathy? How many times did you screw him in the bed we shared? Never. She snapped, her voice tinged with indignation. I would never disrespect you like that. Oh, but doing it everywhere else was just fine, I shot back. Did you know some of our friends knew? They saw what was happening, but none of them had the guts to tell me. I learned the hard way that you can't trust anyone, least of all you. She took a deep breath, as if trying to steady herself. Where do we go from here, Steve? The house is all that's left tying us together. What about the kids? I asked, my voice rising. I'm not giving them up, she said firmly, and there's nothing you can say to make me change my mind. Her defiance only made my mind race faster. I took a moment to steady myself, my tone growing calm but sharp. I'm not here to convince you, Kathy. You got custody because of what you pushed me to do. If I hadn't lost my temper and gone after Bob in his car, things could have been different. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. Bob got exactly what was coming to him, and now it's just you and me. Her eyes widened, her composure faltering. Steve, are you threatening me? Threaten you? Never, I said with mock sincerity. I'd never deprive my kids of their mother. But life's unpredictable, Kathy. Heart attacks, accidents, even a bolt of lightning. You just never know what might happen. I just hope, for their sake, you've got your affairs in order. Her face drained of color, and I knew the line had landed. I'd stolen it from a movie once, but the chill it left in the air was all real. I'm done here, she said, standing abruptly. For what it's worth, we had 12 good years. I'm sorry it ended like this. She leaned forward as if to kiss me on the cheek. I stepped back, shoving her away more forcefully than I intended, and she stumbled slightly. Don't you ever try to touch me again? I growled. Her eyes widened, shock written across her face. I'm sorry. I just thought. You thought what? I interrupted. That we'd be friends. That I'd forgive you. You make me sick. She mumbled a soft sorry, but I cut her off. Don't be, I said coldly. Because I'm not. She turned and walked out, heading down the driveway. As she reached the sidewalk, I called after her. By the way, Kathy, you know that look you just gave me? Bob had the exact same look on his face just before that car hit him. Too bad I didn't have a camera. She broke into a run, and I closed the door with a satisfied smirk. The truth was, I had started the fire at Bob's house. Gatorade bottles of gasoline and a cigarette were all it took. I'd made sure the place was empty before I lit it up, but it didn't spread as fast as I'd hoped. Still, I was in and out in under 5 minutes, tossing the bottles into a neighbor's recycling bin before anyone noticed I was gone. As for Bob's end of life, that wasn't my doing. Dumb luck took care of him. Wrong place, wrong time. If he'd only looked both ways like his mother probably taught him, he'd still be alive. Kathy and her family still think I had something to do with it. Part of me wishes I had, but I wasn't about to risk going back to prison. Instead, I'd let Kathy's paranoia do the work for me. With every doubt I planted, every hint I dropped, she edged closer to a breakdown. And when she finally cracked, I'd be ready to take custody of my kids. Meanwhile, I wasn't going anywhere. I liked my house. I liked my life. And most of all, I liked being just up the street from my kids. Who knows? Maybe one day they'd choose to live with me full-time. The silver lining and all this mess. I'd met someone new. Ellen worked for the Department of Corrections, and I'd met her during my probation check-ins. Tough, no nonsense, and unflinching. She didn't take crap from anyone. We hit it off, but she made it clear there'd be no dating until my probation ended. When it finally did, we went out and I told her about my baggage. She didn't flinch, countering with stories of the lies she'd heard from convicts over the years. Together, we're figuring things out, one step at a time. You need to let go, Steve, she told me one night. If you don't, you'll never move forward. And if you mess up and land back in jail, I'll personally make your life hell. She said it with a grin, but I didn't doubt her for a second. With Ellen, I'm learning to trust again. She keeps me grounded, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm ready to move on, maybe even leo.